at the moment. So good morning. My name is Daniel Hoy. I'm Research Coordinator with Focus Ireland. You're all very welcome to this special event today, the launch of a qualitative study of LGBTQI plus youth homelessness in Ireland in partnership with Belong To. It's great to have so many in attendance and so much interest in the study. We're delighted to launch the study. It's been a long road with some setbacks along the way, but it's great to be at this stage now and to share the work. This study, commissioned by Focus Ireland with support of the Human Dignity Foundation and St. Stephen's Green Trust, and in partnership with Belong To, provides a level of insight and understanding not seen before in the area of LGBTQI plus youth homelessness in Ireland. It's a challenging and under-researched area of homelessness, and this study gives voice and makes visible a very marginalised group in our society and indeed in homeless services. Furthermore, the study offers a range of strong, considered recommendations to policymakers and the homeless sector to respond to the problem of homelessness within the LGBT community, and that is particularly important. Before I introduce our speakers today and talk a little bit about the format, I'd like to take this opportunity to briefly mention some people who were integral to the study. That's Paul Kelly. Paul is a project leader in one of Focus Ireland's youth services and has advocated for this issue and has been calling for research in the area for many years. Sarah Sheridan, my predecessor, who worked with Paul to realise the study, and her support and coordination in the early stages and beyond was invaluable. And of course, Mike Allen, Director of Advocacy, Focus Ireland, whose guidance and direction brought us to this point now. They all deserve great credit. So to our speakers today, Dr. Aideen Quilty and Professor Michelle Norris, who conducted the research and authored the report. Dr. Aideen Quilty is Associate Dean of Social Science and Director of Gender Studies at the School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice, University College Dublin. Aideen locates her undergraduate and graduate teaching as a form of critical civic practice, deepening understandings of cultural diversity and inclusion. Drawing on intersecting queer, feminist and spatial theories, her research seeks to make visible and challenge homo, bi, transphobia across a range of structural and socio-cultural contexts. Professor Michelle Norris is Professor of Social Policy at the School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice, also at UCD. Her teaching and research interests focus on housing policy and urban regeneration. She is an independent member of the National Economic and Social Council and chair of the board of the Housing Finance Agency, which finances social housing in Ireland. Her latest book, entitled Social Housing in Western Europe, The Micro-Political Economy of Resilient and Fragile Systems, will be published by Routledge in spring 2021. Following a presentation by the speakers, we will have contributions from the aforementioned Mike Allen, Director of Advocacy Focus Ireland, from Monina Griffith, CEO Belong To, who are our partner organisation for this research project. And Monina also sat on the advisory group that oversaw the research. And finally, Chris O'Donnell. Chris is a peer worker with SafetyNet and occupied the role of expert by experience on the research advisory group. If everything goes to plan, I'm hoping we'll have some time for questions before we finish at 12. If you do have a question, please use the chat box function. My colleagues in advocacy will be keeping an eye and will endeavour to put some to the panel if we have time at the end. So without any further delay, we'll move on to the presentation, and I believe Aideen is going to start.
Thanks a million, Daniel. Can everybody see it?
Yeah,
great.
Good.
Okay, as Daniel said, it's been a long time in the making. It's the end of a 2-year journey, and it's really wonderful to see the research arrive at this point. It couldn't have happened without Focus Ireland commissioning it and it being supported and championed throughout by Belong To. So Michelle and I would like to thank them sincerely. But also, and most importantly, it couldn't have happened without our research participants. They gave so generously of their time and their insights and their experiences. And we are hugely thankful to them for that. The whole point of doing research is that we share it so that we can have an impact, that we can influence, whether that is policy change or to try to promote best practice. And so today is very much part of that process. So it was the first dedicated study of LGBTQI plus youth homelessness in Ireland. And you know, 2 years in the making is reflected in the very lengthy report that we have generated. So it's not possible for us to, you know, address every single piece of that. But certainly what I want to do this morning, just really briefly, is take you through a snapshot of the why, the how, the who, and most importantly then the what did we find, and the what for, what's the point. And when we get to the what for, Michelle, my colleague, is going to take that up as she addresses the recommendations. So, you know, why did we do this? For very straightforward reasons, all incredibly challenging. We don't have enough understanding of this area. We don't have sufficient data in an Irish context. Youth homelessness is rising internationally and in Ireland. And there's an overrepresentation of LGBTQI plus within the youth homelessness context. Now, we know that because every international piece of research tells us that. And whilst we don't have a dedicated data piece conducted in Ireland, we can anticipate that our data is falling into line with those stats. So you can see between 8 and 37% of an overrepresentation of LGBTQI plus young people in youth homelessness. That is enough, I think, to have anybody wanting to understand more and to do something about it. So what did we do? What did we do? We recruited participants, and from the outset we realized that we had to have a double track to this research project. We needed to have obviously the voices of young people who could share their experiences, but we also, with a strategic eye to making an impact, we knew we also had to engage policymakers and key stakeholders. So myself and my colleague Michelle, we conducted one-to-one interviews. I conducted 22 interviews with young LGBTQI people, and Michelle with stakeholders. Homelessness, you know, one of the wonderful things we realized from the beginning was that this piece of research was giving us an opportunity to put a face on what can be just policy terms. So the ethos typology that we were using that highlights 4 key categories of rooflessness, homelessness, and living in insecure housing and inadequate housing, we suddenly had a picture from our research participants as to what they looked like. So it was hostels and squats and cars and vans and Airbnbs and bedsits and couch surfing. And they mapped specifically to those categories, but the point of this research was that we would deepen our understanding of the real lived experiences that people had. In terms of the stakeholder interviews, they were across 4 key categories. So there was the homeless service providers, civil servants, advocacy groups, and local authorities. And to summarize, and you know, I'm leaving this brief deliberately because Michelle is going to come back to this to weave additional kind of texture when she's talking through the recommendations. In terms of the data, there was little consensus through those interviews as to the population size, but there was consensus that data was incredibly important and needs to be addressed. In relation to training and awareness, there was clear acknowledgement that there was a deficit in that field. In relation to homophobia and transphobia, there was an acknowledgement that it was present, but it was variable. And some organizations had managed to create a dynamic culture in which LGBTQI people were welcome and where homophobia and transphobia were challenged. Other organizations were less successful in doing that. And then the complexity of the arena. There's a complex, challenging relationship between LGBTQI plus youth and frontline services. And as I've said, Michelle will take up many of those in the recommendations. Now, the young people we interviewed, we recruited 22 young people, and recruitment was incredibly challenging. As we went through the research and we realized that so many of the young people, notwithstanding the fact that they had profound experiences of homelessness, they did not identify themselves as homeless. And so that meant that there was an additional challenge to recruitment because the whole area was drenched in invisibility. But we did recruit 22 quite amazing young people. They were aged between 19 and 30 years. They identified across the LGBTQI plus spectrum. So people identified in sexual identity terms as lesbian, gay, bi, pansexual, asexual, and people in gender identification terms identified as cis, trans, and non-binary. The majority of interviews were held in Dublin, 14 of them, but we also interviewed in Cork, Galway, Kerry, Wicklow, and one young person who reflected on their experience in Ireland who is currently living in Scotland. A move that was in no small part prompted by the pricing, the cost, the difficulty in securing housing in Ireland. So what I'm going to do is just take a couple of minutes to take you through the key findings. And we have started to think about those in these three categories. How these young people became homeless, what their experiences of being homeless were, and for those who managed to leave, how did they navigate or negotiate that? So in terms of becoming homeless, one of the key findings was that there was a dual set of trigger factors involved here. Now, as you'd expect, there is a set of well-documented triggers that impact all youth in relation to homelessness. And they are about familial and interpersonal relationships, intrapersonal relationships, and then structural triggers. So the intrapersonal there, we're talking about things like perhaps substance abuse or mental ill health. The structural triggers could be anything from our, housing crisis and finance and class, and all of these power dynamics that we know to play a part. But interestingly, from these interviews, we got a very clear and rich picture about a set of LGBTQI plus specific factors that impacted. And they intersected with the other ones, creating a really, really, really powerful force. And they came through when young people started to come out or when they were transitioning. I think this young participant, it just captures it. The reason she kicked me out at that time was because I had come home wearing makeup after going out on a date with a guy, and she went crazy that night, went upstairs. When I came back down the next day, she basically just told me to leave. And those sorts of temporalities, the timings of these were really important. There was a suddenness to the ways in which so many of these young people found themselves homeless, but it was largely linked, or it mapped directly to the point at which they were coming out or transitioning. In relation to being homeless, there are four key things I want to highlight. The first one I've kind of touched on, the not me, just not seeing themselves as homeless, having very, very particular views of homelessness being about street sleeping, sleeping bags, etc. But their stories mapped directly to how it is we understand homelessness. I'm going to say something about the double closet, about mental health, and about stigma and shame. And all of these were heavily present across the interviews. So this sense of it not being real for them, even before I got homeless, I thought the same. Sleeping bags, most on drugs or whatever, it is so different. And there was a sense across these interviews that these young people had been challenging themselves and their own understandings as to what it might mean to be homeless, and then how they could make sense of their experiences that they were increasingly come to see through the lens of homelessness. The double closet was perhaps one of the most powerful things that we encountered when we were looking at these experiences of being homeless. You start to hate yourself because of the situation you're in, and hiding that you're gay, hiding that you're homeless, it's difficult. And this was a combination of young people saying that they couldn't come out in a homeless context because they were afraid for their safety. And they couldn't come out in an LGBTQI plus context because they were afraid that they would be ostracized. And in both of those, you've got fear and stigma and shame hovering all around them. But the impact of that double closet, when it was internalized by these young people, was immense. And we could see that in relation to the mental health situation, the mental health aggravations that these young people spoke to and highlighted. It was quite staggering for us to hear these stories where over half of these young people had experienced extreme levels of mental ill health, including suicidal ideation. The sorts of things they talked about were stigma and shame, physical health challenges aggravating their mental health challenges. This idea of being on alert or hypervigilant, as one of the young people called it, constantly either being mindful of their belongings or afraid of the environment they were in, or hypervigilant in relation to somebody perhaps realizing they were queer or they were gay in a space where it was not safe to be out. All of those had an impact on people's physical health and well-being, and they constantly talked about exhaustion. And one of the ways that that manifested was through this phenomena of night walking, where these young people, many of them did not want to access hostels. They didn't have anywhere to go, and they were terrified that, as they saw, that they would end up on the street. So walking through the night was what they did to stay awake. And then they would try to find a safe or secure place, often a cafe during the day, where they would sleep. Many of them spoke about couch surfing, and this has been incredibly instructive for us. They talked about it as being profoundly stressful and generating significant levels of guilt. And I think sometimes that can be seen as, or dismissed as part of a kind of a middle class thing of, they're only staying in other people's houses. For these young people, it was immensely stressful. And they all spoke about anxiety for their future. And that future was both tomorrow and in 6 months' time and 12 months' time. It was horrible. It was terrible. I felt like nothing. Yeah, I was drinking a lot. I was just in the middle of this gigantic spiral of shame. And that was an answer to a question I asked about, like, you know, what did it feel like when you experienced homelessness? Another participant, but there is a very grim fucking feeling about it, and particularly the first experience. And it's just the kind of sense of, God, this is a disaster. Like, I have massively messed up. And that was another profound insight. These young people were constantly thinking, analyzing, rethinking their behavior, and thinking through what they might have done, what they could have done. But they were doing that analysis, that thinking, in the context of, for many, no choices available to them as to their options. Now, the frontline services, there are so many references to frontline services across the report. And to capture it, I think, is just to say that it's incredibly complex. Some people completely rejected any sense that they wanted to engage. Other people, and I've come to this in the leaving strategies, spoke really highly of their experience. But the complexity was evident even in the context of the same response that young people gave. So the first one, like my sexuality, a relief to tell his key worker it's just sitting on you all the time. I built up a relationship with her, so I knew I could trust her. But other key workers, I think they don't understand it because they haven't worked with people who've told them that they're gay. So this was a young participant who spoke about how fearful he was of entering into homeless services. But actually, he's one of the participants who spoke about how fundamentally important those services were to him managing to get on a path to exit. And another participant, I'm just really happy that I'm not in hostels and stuff, like as in the free phone and everything, because I know of a lot of people in there and it's not good. And this is one of the things we had lots of conversations with in the steering group about the perceptions that young people had about frontline services and their lived realities of them. Many of them knew of other people. Many of them had had experiences. Some had not had experiences, but were drawing their own inferences on what they had heard. And so leaving homelessness and strategies. Well, there were 4 key things that the young people highlighted. The first was the absolute importance of what they were calling their queer community. The second was the need for tailored services. They wanted people to get it. They didn't want to have to start explaining the importance of pronouns. They didn't want to have to start educating people when they were in a state of acute distress or exhaustion. They just wanted people to understand and get it, and so that they would feel safe. The role of the LGBTQI plus NGOs was incredibly important. They spoke of it as a space, a dedicated space where they felt like they were in the majority. And again, they didn't have to question. And the fourth one, they never called it resilience, but it was abundantly clear across all of their stories that their tenacity, their strength, their resilience, their determination to keep going was what had resulted in so many of them exiting homelessness. And when I asked what they would like to see, it was really clear that they wanted more than just a place to sleep. For those who had been kicked out, the shock and the trauma of that was immense, and they needed more. They needed a whole set of wraparound services, a place they would feel safe, but also a place that they could start to thrive and flourish again. I just think it would be a home for people that just don't have it. And not a home where you have to go and pretend that you're straight and you're not trans, where you have to hide your body or your voice or your partners. Just a place to exist at any point they needed to do that at. So that was the call from our participants as to what they wanted. And our job as researchers, as we see it, is to try to translate those stories into a set of recommendations so that we can act on it. And Michelle, I'm going to stop sharing now. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Aideen. And thanks everyone for coming along today. So as Aideen mentioned, I'm going to talk through some of the recommendations arising from the report. And the recommendations we made are recommendations to policymakers and service providers involved in services for young people and homeless services, such as the Departments of Housing and Children and Youth Affairs, the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive, which funds homeless services in the Dublin region, homeless service providers, which in the context of young adults who are experiencing homelessness are mainly NGOs. And we also made some recommendations to the network of homeless services in Dublin. And then finally, TUSLA, the Child Protection Organisation for Ireland, provides services for young people in foster care and residential care, and for young people who've recently left care. So we have some recommendations in the report that are targeted at TUSLA. So as Aideen mentioned, the recommendations we made reflect the results of the very in-depth and moving interviews with young LGBTQI plus homeless people, and also with policymakers, homeless services providers, and advocacy groups for young people, and advocacy groups for LGBTQI plus people. We also looked at the international evidence on good practice in relation to LGBTQI plus homelessness. So even though services in this country are not very well developed, and indeed services in most of Europe are not very well developed, there are well developed services, particularly in North America and to a lesser extent Australia. And we looked at the evidence from those services and highlighted what we could draw on in terms of informing service provision in this country. And also, we also looked at the goals of the LGBT plus youth strategy, which was published by the government in 2019. Slides moving. I'm sorry, I don't know why my slides aren't moving. So I'll just talk through them. So the first category of recommendations we make in the report address the issue of prevention of homelessness among young LGBTQI plus people. So as Aideen outlined, young LGBTQI plus people now face the risks of homelessness that all young people face. So they may face a risk of homelessness because of poverty, of insecure housing, etc. But in addition to that, they face additional risks because of their sexuality and gender identity. And in particular, the risk of conflict with parents or caregivers around sexuality or gender identity is a concern and heightens their risk of homelessness. So the government propose that a new youth homeless strategy will be published. The latest programme for government commits the government to do that. And we suggest that this should have a prevention strategy, prevention pillar, and it's particularly important that mechanisms to prevent homelessness among young LGBTQI plus people are included. So some of this work can build on the existing good work that's underway in relation to youth homeless prevention. For instance, TUSLA funds a youth homeless prevention mediation service, and also TUSLA has undertaken work in providing additional supports to young LGBTQI plus people who are in foster care and residential care, and also in recruiting foster carers who are gay and trans. And we think that work could be extended, and funding for the youth homeless prevention mediation service should be extended. We also highlight the need to educate and support teachers, youth workers, and parents to support young LGBTQI plus people and to try avert the risk of breakdown in family and caregiver relationships that can lead young people to be homeless. I'm going to try sharing the screen again. Let's see, will that work better? Okay. The second category of recommendations then look at information, training and communication for frontline homeless service providers. So Aideen mentioned the mixed experience young people had of actually using homeless services. Now, part of that reflects the fact that there are very few services specifically for young adults who are homeless, and young people are often forced into mainstream adult services. And Focus Ireland, in fact, is one of the few organisations that provides dedicated services for young people who are homeless. But to address some of the negative experiences young people had in using homeless services and some of the factors that discourage young LGBTQI plus people from entering homeless services in the first place. We put forward a series of proposals around the need for information, training and support for staff and also service users, including just basic infographics, visuals that would highlight to service users that this is an LGBTQI plus friendly space, the importance of training for frontline staff, who we found from meeting with them are very keen to do training. And we also suggested the establishment of a network of key workers who have experience of working with LGBTQI plus homeless youth. We also have recommendations around the need for education and training and awareness raising across the homelessness sector in general. So we suggest further webinars to publicise the key findings and recommendations of the research, awareness raising programme that highlights the presence and specific needs of young LGBTQI plus people in homeless services, including the use of appropriate language and gender pronouns, and a process to monitor the implementation of the recommendations from this research. Aideen mentioned the experience of young people who are in homeless services, and we suggest measures to devise privacy and safety strategies for young LGBTQI plus people using emergency accommodation to address some of these issues. And we also suggest it's worth examining the potential for establishing dedicated accommodation services for LGBTQI plus homeless youth. These are quite common in North America and Australia, particularly in larger cities, and the potential for establishing similar services here should be explored. And then the final issue we examine in the recommendations is the issue of data. So as Aideen mentioned, international research suggests that LGBTQI plus youth are at higher risk of homelessness than their straight or cis peers. And that's primarily because they face additional risks of family breakdown associated with parental and caregiver conflict around their sexuality and their gender identity. But there's no way of knowing definitively whether this is the case for Ireland. And it means that young LGBTQI plus people are invisible to service providers, and services then are not tailored to meet their specific needs, their higher risk of homelessness, or the additional risks they face while using homeless services and the additional barriers they face in accessing homeless services. So we think gathering more data on this group is important. The service provider, or the policymakers and service providers we interviewed did highlight the challenges of collating data about homeless people's sexuality and gender identity, because obviously it raises data protection concerns. It also raises privacy concerns because people have a right not to share this information if they wish. And on occasions it can raise important security concerns in homeless services. People may not but decide it's not a secure environment for them to share this information. But as I said, we feel that collating data on the extent of homelessness among LGBTQI plus people and their particular needs is very important to ensure services can actually address their needs. So we recommend the Department of Housing should establish a group to review the process of collecting and publishing data on homelessness, including LGBTQI plus youth homelessness. And we recommend the potential for using the PASS database of homeless service users, which is managed by the Dublin Region Homeless Executive, for data collation should be examined, or the potential for using a survey of homeless service users, which is the usual method used in other countries, should be examined. So thank you everybody for listening and coming along, and just also to thank Focus Ireland for commissioning the research and colleagues for Belong To from all their support.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Aideen, as well. I've been close to the study now for a while. A very, very substantial, very complex piece of work, and it's a hard thing to do, to summarize all those key points so well in a relatively short amount of time. Thanks very much. So just to recap for people who have joined us late, so we're going to dedicate some time now for some contributions and reflections or thoughts, let's say, on this study. So we will have contributions from Mike Allen, who's the Director of Advocacy Focus Ireland, Moninia Griffith, CEO Belong To, our partner organisation on this project. And Moninia also sat on the advisory group that oversaw the research. And then finally, Chris O'Donnell. Chris is a peer worker with SafetyNet and occupied the role of expert by experience on the research advisory group for this project. So Mike, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks very much to Michelle and Eileen for that, as I say, presentation of very detailed, complex, carefully gleaned research brought together very quickly there. But just, I'm sure everybody listening knows that they got to not only just read the executive report, but the full report as well to get the full depth of this, because probably more than much of the research we've done in the past, you should always read the full report, but I think the complexity and the different dimensions of human identity and interactions that are reflected in this report very well will reward looking at the full documentation. Just wanted to briefly say how we came about doing this report. I mean, this is, Focus Ireland is highly committed to the idea that we need to understand homelessness in a much deeper sense than we do if we're going to solve it. And we've had, since the foundation of the organisation, a long string of research, from the Kellerhouse report on care leavers in the 90s to the work that Paula Mayock did with us and Cliona and Michelle did recently on numbers. But we'd had a meeting a few years ago with our colleagues from Canada, where they were talking to us about the youth homelessness strategy in Canada. And Steve Gates, one of our colleagues on that, brought up a slide which said, if you're not looking at the issue of LGBTQI homelessness in the context of youth homelessness, you're missing the core of the story. And I'm not sure things are the same in here as they are in Canada, but they were finding up to 40% of the young people they were working with as youth homelessness were identifying in LGBTQI or having issues around that, an incredibly high number. And the question went around the audience, well, what do we know about that in Ireland? And the answer was nothing. And in all the work, the research that we had done and all the discussions and the policy work, this dimension of the issue for young people had never emerged. And that in itself is interesting. And I think that it's also reflected in a very profound paradox, which emerges again in the research, that people in management positions and policy-making positions, whether they're gay or straight, don't see this as a problem. They see this as something that we are open organizations and our services are open to everybody, we treat everybody equally. And it's very sort of very 1970s view of equality, but people weren't aware of these issues. But on the front line, on the staff in our services, anybody who is gay, who's working the front line, immediately tells us this is a huge problem. And I think that sort of double blindness and the double closet and all that, the sort of issues that emerge in the report are reflected in that experience. And so that's what that does, I think, is highlight the importance of research and excellent research like this, which draws into the light things which are hidden. Of course, you're going to come as we move forward in this against prejudice and resistance and so on. But in the first case, you just have to deal with the question of not knowing, and the research puts on the table the fact we now know, and now we are required to respond. I think another challenge that you've really got we knew was going to happen in the research and has been dealt with very well by the researchers is the question of the fact that homelessness is miserable for everybody. Homelessness is particularly miserable for young people. And as Michelle has said, we do very little in homeless services to reflect the particular needs of young people. So to what extent is homelessness more miserable or differently miserable for LGBT young people than just the general misery that we inflict upon so many others? And I think the report draws that out, both reminding us that homelessness in itself is an evil and ought to be ended, but that there are additional risks of homelessness and risks in homelessness for people who are LGBTQI, questioning or coming out or in the process of discovering their own identity in their youth and in housing insecurity. And I think that the report does that very well and overcomes what might be a barrier to its acceptance. So the last thing two last things I want to say. First of all, is that to talk about belong to. I mean, when we in Focus Ireland enter into any of these research projects, which involves sort of like an intersection with another area of activity we're not familiar with, we always seek partners who are familiar with that area. That always works. We've always found it works. A lot of people are supportive and so on. But it's rare where the partner organization really enters with an enthusiasm that is equal to our own. And that has been the case in this event. And I want to thank Belong To for that. But they haven't seen the end of us, and I don't think they want to see the end of us on this one. I think there's more to do. Because the last thing I want to say is that there are a lot of recommendations here which are directed at the sector itself. And we could take those on as Focus Ireland, and we're going to take those on as Focus Ireland. But we had a very strong sense with the researchers that these are sector-wide things, and we need to go to the sector-wide institutions. So the Homeless Network in Dublin is the place where all the NGOs come together on a regular basis to work together. And we were able to give them a briefing yesterday on this report and the recommendations, which are there for them, which are about the training, which are about the safe spaces, and about exploring other types of service specific for LGBT people. And we got a unanimously supportive position. We got an agreement to work in collaboration on those issues. And we got a very positive and in no way defensive response from the sector about the importance of the research and the importance of the act on it. So the homeless sector is going to respond to this, take on our responsibility, but we can only do that in partnership with the LGBTQ youth organisations, particularly Belong To. So we see, as always, this piece of research as a really important milestone in a programme, but it's not the end of the programme. The next part of the stage is to try and take the realities that we brought to light for people who hadn't seen them before, and make sure that we respond to our services accordingly. So thank you very much.
Mike, thanks for that considered contribution, and particularly outlining, how we can be as impactful as possible when it comes to this piece of research and those practical next steps. Next, we have Monina from Belong To.
Good morning, everyone, and great to see so many familiar faces on the call this morning. Firstly, just to thank Mike and the team in Focus Ireland. Thanks, Mike, for your very generous words this morning. And I am really glad, and we will stick with you. We are really committed to taking action now that. Thanks to you and thanks to the amazing research team, Aideen and Michelle, we finally have evidence. We finally have data that sheds a light on this issue and gives visibility to young LGBT people who have experienced homelessness and the issues that they face and how it differs from other types of homelessness. So thank you. Thank you for commissioning this. Thank you for working with us on this. It's been a pleasure. And it's been a journey. It's been difficult. I mean, as Aideen alluded to, it was hard to find these young people to share their stories, and it's part of the problem and part of why it remains so invisible, and probably has, some of the reasons, as Mike said, that the services in the sector thought they were doing a good job because this isn't something that was visible to them. So it's part of that. It's the invisibility. It's unconscious bias. Lots of issues, and we're really excited to work with you now to take action to change the sector and the services so we can meet the needs of LGBT young people who are experiencing homelessness at the moment. I suppose I joined Belong To 5 years ago, just after the marriage equality win and referendum, and we were buoyed on a sea of positivity in relation to equality for LGBT people, young and old. And I joined because I knew that, like many people, I suppose, that, you know, homophobia and transphobia wouldn't be cured overnight. It was really important that we had constitutional and legal change, as you know, significantly in our day-to-day lives, as well as, I suppose, as a marker, as a symbolic, in a symbolic way. And I knew that there were, you know, huge difficulties around bullying in schools and online, and difficulties around mental health, that these were huge, big problems. But I have to admit, I was quite ignorant about the problems around LGBT youth homelessness. Michael Barron, who was the founder and director of Belong To, had come from the homeless service, and that's actually where Belong To grew out. There was the need for an LGBT specific youth service identified, because there were so many LGBT young people coming into the service, and because Michael was out, a lot of young people were sent his way. So it was out of that Belong To grew out of. But I guess I thought in 2015 that parents and families and places where young people were living would be more inclusive, more accepting, and that gender identity and sexual orientation wouldn't be such an issue, and it wouldn't cause such conflict that it might lead to homelessness. But very soon after joining Belong To, it became very apparent to me. In fact, one of the first big cases that I was involved with was a young man who, an Irish young man who was sent to a conversion therapy camp outside Ireland, and we worked closely with the Department of Foreign Affairs to help get him out of that camp and help find him accommodation. And I'm happy to say that he's living a great life as a young gay man outside of Ireland now. But you know, that kind of stuff, I knew it happened in movies, but I didn't realize it happened here in Ireland. Some of the other kind of stories that I've come across, a young man who arrived with his backpack on our doorstep from a rural community, so he travelled up on the bus. He'd been outed by some lads on his sports team, and things become very hostile, very dangerous, very unsafe for him. And so he just decided to leave home and arrived in Dublin, not knowing anyone, with nowhere to stay. And our youth workers, of course, did their best to try and find him some temporary accommodation, and continue to support with him to this day in relation to his coming out process, and coming to terms with how his life has really been turned upside down. Sometimes it's a religious issue as well. We had a young man who came from a small town where his community for high levels of religiosity, and so high levels of homophobia. And so when he was kicked out, he really had nowhere else to go, because his co-community share the same values. But when we worked with the university that he was attending, they were really supportive and were able to help out. But it's not always issues like this. It's not always to do with religion, class, or anything like that. We've also had young people arrive with everything they own in a black plastic bag. I'm thinking of one young man in particular who had a very supportive relationship with his parents, but when he came out, very suddenly came home and everything he owned was in that black plastic bag in the front garden, and he was told not to come back in. And the other thing, I suppose, is, you know, the Aideen spoke about this, about the connection with coming out. It still is a difficult thing to do. It's still our top presenting issue in terms of the issues that young people come to us for support around. And I always remember a mum telling me a story. Her son was gay. He had a long-term boyfriend. The boyfriend was saying that he wasn't out at home. The mum said, oh, listen, just come out and tell your parents everything will be fine. Of course, they love you and they'll accept you and that. So he did, and the parents kicked him out. And so she had to take him in. And so be careful to anyone out there on the call with teenagers in their lives. Sometimes you think you're doing the right thing, but really you have to understand that it isn't safe for everybody to come out. And even in Belong To, in our youth service, we always work with young people to support them to come out if and when it's safe for them to do so, and to have backup plans around that. So again, I suppose just to thank the Focus Ireland and UCD team for shedding light on some of these stories and giving us the evidence base. Now it's time to take action, and Mike referred to some of the, I suppose, actions in relation to meeting the needs of young people now and in terms of their experiences with homelessness. And I really, I suppose, want to mention the work that needs to happen further upstream in relation to the prevention. So before we ever get to the stage where a young person has to experience homelessness, I think it's really important that we continue to work on addressing the issues of homophobia and transphobia in public opinion in our society, and also in relation to youth services, continued sustained and increased investment in youth services and in family support services. So when there is conflict, that there are professionals who have the expertise, who have the confidence and the competence to really work with families who are experiencing conflict, where gender identity or sexual orientation might be part of that. I guess just to end, the biggest thing for me to take away, and I hope the message that all of you will take away, is that nobody should really have to choose between being who they are and having a safe place to live. And with that, I'll hand over to Chris. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vanina. First of all, it's great to hear your words of encouragement and support, and also for offering those young people's stories. I think it's so important to humanize this issue, and I think that's something that the research does particularly well. So for our last contribution today, and I don't think we'll have time for questions and answers, unfortunately, but I hope people will glean as much information as they can from the reports that will be available online. So Chris, if you're ready.
Yes, indeed. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Chris, maybe you could you introduce yourself a little bit and maybe talk about what expert by experience means?
Yes, indeed. And thank you for the introduction, Daniel. I'm a peer support worker for Safety Net, which is a medical-based charity, and my position there is based on my own experience of homelessness. So basically, expert by experience means you have expertise in the area by lived experience itself. So in 2017, I entered the homeless system. I stayed in night shelter accommodation in the hostels and later in a women's only hostel. No, during this time, I was not out. I didn't feel safe being open about my sexuality at all. For this reason, I purposefully dressed as neutrally as possible, and I would avoid or avert the subject if it ever came up or I sensed it was coming up. Now, I'm not saying that everyone in the homeless system is homophobic. However, the hostels can have a really brutalizing effect on someone's kind of I suppose you'd say, psychological tapestry, and they're really ready to blow for the most minor of things, things they might not even care about in normal circumstances. That said, this hiding of sexuality or gender identity is something that is common in the system, and that's reflected in the report. And also worth mentioning here is the lack of education and lack of awareness are rife in the system. And as the report puts forward, the trans community is particularly at risk here. Um, Also, during this time, I started to write about the experience. It was something I wasn't seeing reflected in the media coverage of the housing crisis, that crucial first person perspective. And I wanted to convey something about the atmosphere of the hostels, the bureaucracy of them, and in some cases, the dehumanization. I felt it was important to have this recorded, the knowledge of homelessness as a lived experience, which needs to be part of the picture. And this report does exactly that. So after several months in the hostels, I was lucky to be assigned a really good caseworker who helped me get out of homelessness. And since then, I've continued to write about homelessness, including LGBTQI plus homelessness, for newspapers and magazines, including the GCN, um, which is in the process of getting back up and running. And I've also started working for Safety Net, exploring peer experience of the hostels. I really, really consider myself privileged to do the work I do. I believe there's significant importance of peer knowledge and lived experience in tackling the issues at hand. So I'm really pleased to be asked to speak at the launch of what is an important and groundbreaking report. It's the first of its kind, really, in Ireland. And with the voices of lived experience and the expert analysis, it is a really valuable contribution to the field. Now, from the report, it really struck me just how at risk trans people are in the homeless cohorts. Also, how so much LGBTQI plus homelessness is invisible or undocumented. The LGBTQI plus community has a long and proud history of providing support structures for one another in situations of family conflict and rejection. LGBTQI plus communities often become alternative families for people. And on a side note, this is really reflected in drag culture, with drag mothers and fathers and drag daughters and sons. And this is an important thing and something queer people should be really proud of. But it does mean that the phenomenon of LGBTQI plus homelessness is hard to quantify, as is acknowledged in the report. So another thing that really struck me in the report was the role of resilience, that incredible resilience that LGBTQI plus people experience and demonstrated a particularly strong core of in this study. This is something which chimes with my own research, interviews for journalistic purposes, and also for my work with Safety Net. Some particular interviews have blown me away. One interview in particular I was really struck by. It was with a young trans person who would have been categorized as hidden homeless, which is just couch surfing and relying on social supports to get by. And they were by no means resigned to their position. They had an optimistic lens. They expressed their active intentions and plans to become rehoused as quickly as possible. And I have to say that rarely have I witnessed such strength in the face of adversity. So for these reasons, I think it is so important that a report like this exists. And I want to finish by acknowledging the incredible time and care that has been spent in compiling it. I would like to thank Focus Ireland and Dr. Aidan Quilty and Dr. Michelle Norris of UCD, as well as Belong To, for the incredible work they have done in bringing such an important piece of research for homelessness and LGBTQI plus issues to life. Thanks.
Chris, thank you very much. Thank you for offering your experiences and your story. I'm delighted you were available to speak today. It's really, really appreciated. And thanks for your insights in terms of the study. You know, it's so important to have that lived experience for you. I'm delighted that you appreciate the report as well. And you
Big time. Yeah.
And you look at it so positively. So on that note, I'm going to wrap it up for today, folks. I want to thank our speakers, Michelle and Nadine, and congratulate them on an excellent piece of research. I also want to thank Mike, Moninia, and Chris for their thoughtful and insightful contributions, and my colleagues in the advocacy team for helping support the event. And finally, I want to thank you all for attending today. This study will be accessible on the Focus Ireland website and also on Belong To's website very shortly. And we're just confirming a few little minor details, and it will be available on both websites today. So please download, read, and share. Thank you and goodbye.